Hi, everyone. This is the second of our PowerPoints on the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, covering just the 2 years, 1964, 1965. A lot going on in that period. And as I mentioned to the class, if you have interest in exploring this topic in more depth, I cover it extensively in a course I'll be teaching in the spring on America in the 60s. But let's jump into the conclusion of the civil rights movement in the 60s. We're going to begin by taking a brief look at another person who was an important civil rights leader and a person who remains one of the most misunderstood figures in American history, Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, his family moved to Lansing, Michigan when he was an infant after their home was burned down by Klansmen in Omaha. Both his parents were Black nationalists involved in the Marcus Garvey-led Black nationalist movement at that time in American history. Malcolm grew up attending integrated schools, although frequently he was the only Black student in his grade level and sometimes the only Black student in the school. He was an excellent student, popular, well-liked, but as he wrote later, he was subjected to racist jokes and racist slurs on a daily basis from white classmates who considered him their friend, and also from teachers. And it was his father's murder, although the police in Lansing ruled it an accident, pretty conclusive that his father was murdered because of his Black nationalist activities. This sends Malcolm's family into an economic tailspin. This happened during the Depression of the 30s. His mother suffers a mental breakdown, and all of the kids are in his family, as Malcolm separated from his siblings, they're all distributed to different foster homes. Malcolm dropped out of high school, moved to Boston, where he lived with a half-sister, and he had a number of different legitimate jobs there, but gradually drifted into a life of hustling and then a life of crime, eventually becoming a drug addict himself, and arrested for pawning stolen items. He began engaging in burglary to support his drug habit too. He ends up incarcerated in prison in Massachusetts, and it's there through siblings that he is exposed to the ideas of a Black nationalist organization, the Nation of Islam. His ideology fit what Malcolm had been exposed to from his parents growing up. An organization that was opposed to integration and advocated racial separatism, building economic strength within the Black community. And these fit with, as I said, the Black nationalist ideas that Malcolm had learned from his parents. And after his release from prison in the 1950s, Malcolm, who was a skilled orator and organizer, begins a rapid rise, becoming a minister within the Nation of Islam and eventually the number 2 person in the organization, second only to the leader Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm was extremely intelligent, intellectually and curious person, and he eventually outgrows the limitations of the Nation of Islam. He leaves the organization in 1963, converts to being a Sunni Muslim. You see a picture of him here participating in the Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca, in 1964, and starts 2 different organizations to try to cooperate and work with the mainstream civil rights movement. The Organization for Afro-American Unity, OAAU, made a particular effort to reach out to Black college students and younger Black activists. Malcolm's philosophy evolved during this period. Over the last year of his life, he traveled abroad extensively, and as I mentioned in the class, he came to look at civil rights in the United States as part of a larger struggle worldwide by people of color that extended beyond the borders of the United States. And he began framing it as an issue of human rights. He said this repeatedly. It's not just an issue of civil rights, Malcolm would say, it's an issue of human rights, and advocated for bringing the United States up on charges before the United Nations for human rights violations. People often misinterpret Malcolm's ideas as advocating violence, which he did not. Malcolm was not a violent person. Where he differed in his philosophical approach from King is that Malcolm did believe in self-defense. So if you were being attacked by a policeman's billy club, Malcolm believed you had a right to defend yourself. And whereas King tended to frame the civil rights movement as a moral struggle, Malcolm saw it as a power struggle. So he became engaged with and cooperated with the mainstream civil rights movement, but adhered to his philosophy of Black nationalism. So Malcolm was an impactful figure. He's assassinated in early 1965, but his legacy is going to impact the mainstream civil rights movement. And one of the things that the civil rights movement focused on from 64 into 65 was voting rights. And this was exemplified in particular by the Freedom Summer campaign in Mississippi during the summer of 1964. So this was a concept conceived by Robert Moses, a college student and a leader in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Moses had been doing dangerous work trying to register blacks to vote in Mississippi for 3 summers and was frustrated by the lack of progress, the threats of violence, and the fact that the rest of the country didn't seem to be paying much attention to the fact that here 100 years after the end of the Civil War, blacks were still being denied the right to vote in many parts of the South, which is how the existing white political power structure maintained itself. And so his idea with the Freedom Summer campaign was to interview 1,000 white college student volunteers who would be screened, interviewed, and trained by SNCC staff, and then come to work in Mississippi alongside SNCC volunteers throughout the summer, registering people to vote and also offering summer classes through what Moses termed freedom schools that would offer a summer curriculum for black students in the state of Mississippi. It's an ambitious plan. Violence surrounded this from the beginning. Just as the first volunteers were set to depart from their training centers to arrive in Mississippi, 3 activists turned up missing: Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner. As I mentioned in class, it turned out that the 3 of them who had gone to investigate the firebombing of a black church were arrested by sheriff and his deputies in a county rural area in Mississippi on a trumped-up speeding charge, held in the jail for nearly 24 hours, not allowed to contact anyone on the outside, finally released at night, but then pulled over again, forced into a different car, and taken to a remote site where they were executed and buried. The Freedom Summer campaign had a profound impact on everyone involved, particularly white college students. They showed this picture in class. These white students were from middle class, upper middle class, and some even from affluent backgrounds. They had never really been exposed to segregation and the brutal nature of poverty for Black Americans in the South. Like you see this house, they just hadn't seen poverty of this sort before. For a lot of these students, it ended up radicalizing them. Many of these students returned to their campuses and became involved in other movements like the free speech movement that happened at the University of California, Berkeley in the fall of 1964, which was led by students who had participated in the Freedom Summer Campaign. And the Freedom Summer Campaign revives interest in protecting voting rights, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that Lyndon Johnson got passed initially had a provision in it protecting voting rights and empowering the Justice Department to take action in locations where voting rights were being suppressed. Johnson had removed that section from the bill as a compromise to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, brings it back as a separate piece of legislation, and that's passed as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, although much of this current bill has been gutted by the current Supreme Court in a couple different rulings, which has contributed to ongoing voter suppression issues, even in the most recent presidential election. I mentioned Malcolm being assassinated in February of 1965. It was shortly after that his book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, based on extensive conversations he had with the writer Alex Haley, was published. And this would have a profound impact on Black activism from that point on. Malcolm's ideas found a receptive audience among younger Black activists, many of whom had been kind of wary of him during his life. Malcolm, as I mentioned in class, used history extensively in his sermons and teachings, really exposed the history of America's racist past and how that racism had persisted and impacted and shaped society in the 1960s, just as it still does today. Was one of the first people to start using the term Black to replace the term Negro. So he has a profound influence. He's just not as well remembered as Martin Luther King Jr., but extremely important part of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King is assassinated just 3 years later in 1968 in Memphis. King had become more radical in the last 2 years of his life. We still tend not to talk as much about the sermons that King gave during this period, where he offered a scathing critique of capitalism, talked about democratic socialism and a redistribution of wealth in the United States. He was organizing a poor people's campaign for a march on Washington of impoverished Americans of all ethnicities at the time he was killed in Memphis in 1968. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., as I mentioned, were young people, only 39, each of them, only 39 years old at the time of their deaths. Incalculable loss for the United States, losing these two important leaders. And so as I summed up to the class, the civil rights movement loses its momentum after 1965. A lot of Americans felt that these issues had been sufficiently addressed with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There were growing divisions within the movement itself, and the loss of key leaders like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, these are people who really were irreplaceable. And the Vietnam War becomes the key political issue of the 60s, replacing civil rights. But the civil rights movement's impact on American politics, American society, and the American people were profound and key to understanding this period of American history.